Alright, in just the past couple weeks, we've seen all three of the major Khabib's team Dagestanis fight. We've seen Islam, we've seen Umar, and we've seen Usman Nurmagomedov. And let's define what we're really talking about when we say the Dagestanis, because people don't often think about it, but that includes guys like Shavkat Rakhmonov, Ankalaev, technically even guys like Abubakar Nurmagomedov, Saeed Nurmagomedov, other guys like that. That does not include guys like Khamzat Chimaev, although he looks like one. He's Chechen, he's not Dagestani. But for the purpose of this video, we're going to talk about the guys that are on Khabib's team, mainly these top three guys in Umar Nurmagomedov, Usman Nurmagomedov, and Islam Makhachev, the guys that are close to Khabib, who kind of coined the Dagestani group, right? Who's obviously the original big name guy in the UFC that kind of brought knowledge to this small part of Russia where these great fighters are coming out of. And it also seems that the ones who are really great, the ones who all have that kind of similar style, which we'll also talk about because they really don't at this point have a similar style, they all come out of Khabib's camp. Those are the main ones. Those are what people are talking about when they say Dagestanis for the most part. But in the last couple weeks, we've seen them struggle aside from Islam. We've seen Umar lose to Morba. Beforehand, he was undefeated. We saw Usman, who was undefeated, win, but a very controversial close decision to a guy that's outside of the PFL, or rather outside of the UFC. Now, we'll get to that because his opponent was very good, and he certainly does have a very good argument for winning that fight regardless of the controversy. But let's talk about that fight right now. So, last week at PFL, we saw Paul Hughes versus Usman Nurmagomedov. Usman was a massive favorite going into that. I think like minus 340, minus 400. He was kind of expected to dominate, especially with the grappling, but I think a big factor in that fight was that Paul Hughes showed amazing takedown defense, and he ended up dominating the later rounds. A lot of that was because Usman's cardio did get a little bit exposed. Now, that's not to say it's awful or that he kind of completely was gone in the last couple rounds, because he still did have good moments, especially in the grappling, and he had decent striking moments. But it's pretty clear that Paul Hughes won at least the 5th round, maybe the 4th round too. Plus, when you add in the point that was taken away from Usman because of the fouls, it really makes it hard to score that fight, especially because the early rounds were so close in so many ways. Another weakness of Usman's that got exposed was the shots to the body, which I think also contributed to making those later rounds hard for him, kind of made him look like his cardio was failing, which is a similar thing that happened to Umar, but we'll get into that later. I think the main key that Paul Hughes had to having a great performance against Usman was that, by my count, I couldn't find the stats anywhere after the fight. Usman landed maybe 2 or 3 takedowns, 2 at the least, 3 at the most, out of maybe 10, 15 that he shot on Paul Hughes. Paul Hughes' takedown defense looked amazing. Anytime Usman would try to engage in a clinch where he could go to their typical like Islam Makhachev type judo takedowns, Paul Hughes would punish him with body shots and knees to the body. Now, Usman got his own good knees to the body in there too, but for what we're talking about, it worked perfectly to stuff those clinch takedown attempts. And then shots from the open, Paul Hughes did, for the most part, a great job of skipping away from those. Good single leg defense, good double leg defense, good sprawls. Paul Hughes, for the most part, shut down Usman's game in the wrestling and grappling. The couple times that Usman was able to take him down, he did basically nothing on the top. There was a period where he did get off a few good elbows and a little bit of ground and pound, but that was only after Paul Hughes got off his own good elbows from his back. Now, in the striking, Usman Nurmagomedov is widely considered kind of like the most striking heavy of the Dagestanis. Maybe Umar too, but Usman even more so. He's known for those quick kicks, high kicks. I believe he knocked out Pitbull, or not Pitbull with that. It was one of those PFL guys he knocked out with a leaning back kind of question mark kick almost. He does have extremely impressive kicking game, and you could see that against a guy like Paul Hughes, who's more of a boxing heavy guy. I think where Usman probably won the fight on the scorecards was the fact that he was just more active, right? He was landing a lot of those low kicks. Not all of them were landed well, but he was just taking initiative a lot more than Paul Hughes. But Paul Hughes was dominant in the boxing area. When they were just exchanging combinations, Paul Hughes was winning those. He was ripping to the body. He landed a few good shots upstairs. That uppercut was landing for him. Um, and in the grappling, especially a moment I remember in the 5th round, Paul Hughes was able to reverse one of Usman's takedowns, kind of get a duck around under the arm, spin back, almost take his back, but being a striker primarily, he chose to stand back up. He did kind of get away from the body shots, Paul Hughes that is, in the late rounds. That may have been what cost him what looked like could have been a finish in like the 3rd and 4th when he was really ripping to the body and Usman was reacting to it, especially before the weird headbutt stoppage type of thing where Usman did get a few minutes to rest. It looked like Paul Hughes was possibly heading towards a kind of like exhaustion plus body shot TKO. And yeah, at the end of the day, I didn't score all the rounds. I was watching live, not scoring the rounds, but I did believe Paul Hughes was going to win it. Now, that's not to say that this was necessarily a robbery. I have no way of going back and watching it at this point, and I've seen good arguments that Usman won the fight. In my head, I thought it was kind of like a 60-40 to Hughes, but I knew, regardless, Abu Dhabi or Dubai, wherever it was, they're going to score that to Usman, right? Usman Khabib is basically their whole, like their entire advertisement campaign is being connected to Khabib, having Khabib's one of his proteges. But I'm not all that upset about this. I think they will run back a rematch, which is fine. It's not like Paul Hughes was an undefeated guy. This built his name a lot. But we're focusing on the Dagestani side of this. This was a performance that made Usman look very, very human. And more importantly, this was against a guy that has never been a champion in a major promotion. This is against still like a up-and-coming guy, and Paul Hughes still a young guy. This is not a guy like a Poirier, a Gaethje, and Arman Tsarukyan, a Gamrot, a Hooker, a Beneil Dariush. This is a guy that has not even proven himself to be at that level, and Usman Nurmagomedov is a guy that was seen as like a locked-in potential UFC title challenger one day, and this kind of poked some holes in that. That's not to say that Usman Nurmagomedov didn't look good, because he still did, but let's move on to one I've already talked about, so I'll keep this quick. Umar versus Morab. Morab won that, obviously. I wouldn't say he necessarily exposed Umar's game, but he did show that it is very possible to beat these guys. He was able to take Umar down, which we haven't really seen against these Dagestani guys from Khabib's camp. And when Umar was in kind of decent positions on the ground, he was not able to do anything, which from a guy like Khabib, which we'll talk about later, anytime Khabib had you on the ground, he was hurting you, he was taking away all of your defenses, and he was getting something on the ground. So maybe if he's not going to get a submission that round, he's at least going to leave you bloody, right? And on the feet, it was competitive, which is surprising because on paper, Umar is a much better striker than Merab. But that took Umar's, he's still young. He still looked like he's probably the second, maybe third best fighter in that division. We'll talk about that later. But let's move on. Now, Islam looked very impressive against Moicano, as he should, right? It's Moicano. We all know that Islam's the best lightweight by far. And he's already beaten what was the best featherweight, the best fighter in the world at the time. But let's talk about how close that fight was. I know this was a couple years ago now, but I think it's relevant in talking about how Islam could be defeated in the future. It's good for making a blueprint to fight Islam in the future. So I think the main problem for Islam in his fight against Volk, we saw that when somebody is properly trained, properly prepared, and just a good all-around fighter, Islam is not going to be able to submit him on the ground. We saw an entire round where Islam had Volk's back, probably his best position, and he was able to do nothing with that. I wouldn't say he landed really much damage on the ground. Now, what was really going for Islam in that fight, and what was extremely impressive from Islam, is that he was able to outdamage Volk like a top 5 striker in the UFC on the feet, which is obviously very impressive, and why Islam, a big part of the reason why Islam is undisputedly pound for pound number 1 right now, best technical, best physical fighter, pound for pound in the world, in my opinion, in most people's opinion. But another issue that's kind of been common among these Dagestani guys is that when they get into the late rounds with guys that aren't just on the ground, right? Guys that are good enough on the ground to be able to take it to the feet too. Really good, well-rounded guys like a Paul Hughes, like a Merab, like a Volk. The cardio kind of starts to fade in the 5th round, right? In the 4th and 5th, the cardio favored Paul Hughes. The cardio obviously favored Merab. and the cardio favored Volk. We all remember Volk pounding down on him at the end of the fifth. What caused a lot of people to think Volk won that fight at first. I was one of them. Looking back, no, Islam won that fight. It was very close, though. Justified decision, but very close. And since then, Islam hasn't had another test like Volk. Obviously, that's not his fault. He did fight to sign Arman, which would have been another great test. But we just haven't seen another guy that would be able to work a similar game plan to Volk that worked out pretty well fight Islam since then. Since then, he's fought probably the worst version of Volk we've ever seen. Dustin, who's good, but just kind of an old head at this point. He doesn't really have that super well-rounded skill set. Moicano, who's good, but not at that top level. And hopefully we'll see a guy like Ilia maybe next. I think his next fight, regardless, will be a super well-rounded guy. It'll either be Ilia, Arman, or move up and fight like a Shavkat. Either one of those are going to be able to work a good game plan. All those are well-rounded guys. All those, I think, would test Islam to his limits. So, in my opinion, Islam's biggest challenges are yet to come, but Islam versus Volk 1 is the best indicator that he is beatable. So, let's compare them to the guy that started it all for the Dagestanis, Khabib. Now, the issue with Khabib is that when you really think about it, he never fought any of these super well-rounded guys. Like a Morba, right? Like an Arman Tsarukyan. Like even a Paul Hughes. Now, that's not to say that he would lose to all of these guys, but we just don't know. What we do know is that Khabib is likely a more dominant grappler than anybody else in his camp. Now, when you talk about Umar, when you talk about Usman, I think that's obvious. I think everybody would agree with that. When it comes to Khabib versus Islam in the grappling, there's a conversation to be had, but in my opinion, Khabib is just more... He's just more effective when he takes you down. Now, obviously, Islam has skills that Khabib never was able to develop, but when we talk about just the grappling, once you have the guy on the ground in an advantageous position, what are you going to do with it? I think that Volk fight, if Khabib had those positions, Volk would have been finished in that first fight. Now, you can disagree with that. We'll never know because Khabib retired when he did. But if you look at the fighters that he did fight, Justin, Dustin, Connor, his good big wins, not his only wins, but his best wins, as soon as he really got a really good position on the ground, he was either beating these guys up with ground and pound or submitting them, and he did end up submitting each of those guys, which is very impressive. Islam fought one of those guys in Dustin. He struggled more on the ground. Now, you could say that's a more evolved Dustin Poirier, which I agree with, but how much really can a guy evolve in a few years when you're already in your 30s, late 30s, mid 30s? I'm not sure. Now, Islam did eventually get the submission, but he struggled more on the ground than Khabib. He struggled more to control these guys, and because of that, Dustin was able to work on the feet, which eventually caused issues for Makhachev and brought him to those 4th and 5th rounds where he is a bit weaker. Now, another issue with Khabib is that his striking was pretty questionable, right? Umar's striking is not questionable. Usman's striking is not questionable. Islam's striking is definitely not questionable. And as for the matchups that they're getting in their divisions, I think especially Umar is 100% getting harder matchups in his last couple fights and from here on out than a guy like Khabib did. Like I said, Khabib's best wins, Connor, Dustin, Justin. Umar, on the other hand, just beat Corey Sandhagen and lost to Morba. In my opinion, those are two harder fights than anybody Khabib ever fought. And then looking forward, who is there for him to fight? He's going to fight guys like Sean O'Malley, harder than anyone Khabib fought, in my opinion. Petr Yan, again, another super good guy. And then even if you look down the rankings, you've got Henry Cejudo, you've got Song Yadong, you've got a bunch of really good guys at bantamweight, and we know Umar is going to stay near the top of bantamweight, probably still be an eventual title holder, but this guy just has insane guys coming for him. Same with Islam, to be honest. You've got Topuria in the future, you've got Shavkat in the future, you've got Arman Tsarukyan in the future. So the point that the UFC is at has evolved since the time of Khabib, and maybe even Khabib himself wouldn't have been as effective as he was back then. So it's really hard to judge whether they're better or worse than Khabib. All right, and then for Usman, we got to talk about who's next. I think immediately the next fight that should be made, and I'm sure PFL will do this, is the Paul Hughes rematch. I'm sure PFL noticed that that was the most hype a PFL card has generated since the Ngannou fight, and this is without having to pay Ngannou numbers, right? I believe he just signed a new contract like a week ago with PFL, which is a bit disappointing, but it does mean we'll probably get that Hughes rematch at least. And then after that, what is there? If he beats Hughes, a trilogy. If Hughes beats him, a trilogy. I'm sure. If he beats Hughes again, there's really no one left in the PFL lightweight division. I looked through it. What is he gonna fight? Benson Henderson at this point again, right? Primus again. Pitbull just signed with GFL, I believe. Is he gonna fight AJ McKee, who already lost to Paul Hughes? I don't see why any of that would happen. I think he's just gonna fight a couple cans, beat him easily, if assuming he gets done with Paul Hughes. And then enter the UFC and hopefully be given a guy like Grant Dawson. I think a guy like 10 to 15, he would definitely deserve as a long-reigning PFL champion. But I think that would also be a really good test for Usman, because all he needs is a guy that is going to be able to negate him in the wrestling, which I know is easier said than done, but there are multiple guys like that in the lightweight top 15. I really think a guy like Grant Dawson would push him to his limits, which honestly, when you think about that, that's not what you would expect from a real like Dagestani guy, Khabib, Islam type of guy. But what I'm trying to get here to, what I'm trying to get to here, not all of these guys are Khabib and Islam. They're all different. They all have different styles. There's no one uniform Dagestani style, right? Because we saw Khabib, we saw the way he trains his guys before they really came in. But even Islam, the guy that was seen as most like close, similar to him, he's evolved into a different striker. Umar, obviously a much different striker. Usman himself, a much different person, a much different fighter style. So we can't really consider Dagestanis to have one uniform style anymore. And if you look at the ones outside of Habib's camp, guys like Sharpuda Magomedov, he's weak in the grappling, which we would never expect from a Dagestani, right? Ankalaev, in my opinion, a much better striker than he is a wrestler and grappler. We can't really consider these guys to be figured out by an opponent that beat them because they all have different styles. We can't assume one Dagestani is just like the next, right? So I think they all need different tests that are going to test them in different areas. All right, and then for Umar, like I said, I think he's got a murderer's row coming up. I think his next fight should be Davison Figueiredo. I think Figueiredo deserves to have another fight near the top, even though he did lose his last one, because he is that former good champion at flyweight. He does have really good wins already at bantamweight, and his only loss at bantamweight is against another super good guy in a super fun, close decision. So yeah, and I think it kind of gives Umar a chance to stay near the top. I'm not saying Umar deserves a rematch, obviously, because he's beaten one ranked guy. So give him a guy that's around like 5 or 6 in Davison Figueiredo. Let the winner stay up. Should be a fun fight, big name fight. And then after that, win or lose, there's guys like Jose Aldo in the future for him, another guy that's going to be able to test him with his great takedown defense and striking. And then Piotr Jan, arguably the most well-rounded guy in the UFC, one of the most technical guys in the UFC, another guy that's going to be able to out-technique Umar in the striking probably, and be able to stuff some of his wrestling. Now, I'm not saying all these guys beat Umar, but they all test Umar for sure. And then for Islam, massive matchups coming up. I think the Arman matchup is even bigger next time we see it. I think the Ilia Topuria matchup might be the biggest fight in the UFC, maybe just behind John Jones versus Tom Aspinall. Maybe even bigger, though, to be honest. Either way, this guy's got a lot of great fights coming up, too. So what I really want to close this video off by saying is that we have seen the Dagestanis look human lately, and I think that's a good thing. It's a good thing for them. It's a good thing for us, because when you're not just dominating, it's obviously the fights are funner, right? They're more entertaining, higher stakes, and what's better is that we've seen that, in my opinion, Khabib and Islam at their start were just maybe a generation ahead of the rest of the UFC, and now we're seeing the rest of the UFC come up. We're seeing them catch up to the Dagestanis in a way. We're seeing them adapt. I think these guys change the game in that everybody has to be well-rounded now, which is great. and I'm appreciative of that. So that's it for the video today. If you liked it, leave a like, subscribe. I'll be making more videos. I enjoy doing it, and have a great day.